We now move to question number 5, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr Speaker, this question is to the Minister for Māori Development and asks, does he stand by all his statements?
Speaker.
The Honourable Te Uraraia Flavel.
Tēnā koe, tēnā tātou katoa to the Honourable Member. Yes, in the context they were given.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why did the Minister, when asked about his or his staff's involvement in programming for the Māori television whānau ora debate, deny involvement, A, at the Māori Affairs Select Committee on 17 June, B, in this chamber on 17 June, and again yesterday when he knew those denials were false?
The Honourable Te Uraraia Flavel.
Mr Speaker, I reject that statement.
Question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why did he claim to the media yesterday that at his meeting with the CEO of Māori Television, content was not discussed when he knew that to be false?
The Honourable Te Uraraia Flavel.
Mr Speaker, in the context of the discussion yesterday, the context was around whānau ora. In my purview as the Minister for Māori Development and indeed a responsible Minister for Māori Television, in the context of wider statement of intent that is given to me, which was a part of the discussion with Mr Maxwell, certainly one of those parts of the statement of intent is content in the widest sense. In short, and it includes such things as growth and protection of te reo Māori me ona tikanga, 100 million engagements per week, meeting place of Māori youth. Mr Speaker, that's the context of the discussion.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why did he deny to the media yesterday that content was discussed when the CEO, at that time, nothing whatsoever to hide on the 22nd of May in his email to staff, 2 days after the meeting the Minister confirmed that content was discussed? Was the CEO lying?
Speaker.
The Honourable Te Uraraia Flavel.
Mr Speaker, in the context of the discussion, I can't answer for Mr Maxwell, but certainly did make a statement that around the discussions and talked about strategic pillars as well, partnerships as well, alliances as well, people as well. All of that was a part of the discussion. And in the context of what I'm required to have report back to the House upon, statement of intent, the discussion around content was certainly a part of, in that context, was a part of the discussion.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
When his colleague Marama Fox messaged Mihi Forbes when the whānau ora debate was spiked and claimed that the Māori Party had no part in it, was he aware that she had done this, and did she do that with his authority?
The Honourable Te Uraraia Flavel.
Mr Speaker, that's outside the realms of my delegations as a Minister.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why did the Minister yesterday admit knowledge of his staff's involvement in seeking to have New Zealand First removed from the debate using the words, quotes, of which I was aware, that appears in the television coverage of yesterday's debate, then later changed his Hansard to deny knowledge when he knew, again, that denial was false?
The Honourable Te Uraraia Flavel.
In answer to the second part of the question, I deny absolutely any involvement in the changing of Hansards until the record was corrected today.
Point of order.
Point of order, the Right Honourable Winston
Mr
Peters.
Speaker, I seek to table last night's Hansard with a change in it.
Order,
he says he didn't do it.
Order. No, the draft Hansard is prepared and available to all members. I get it about 4:30, 5 o'clock. It's not necessary to table it.
Point of order, Speaker.
Point of order, Right.
This is not a boring matter, Mr Speaker. The fact is, one can change a Hansard to change spelling or clarity or a misquote, but to put in the word not.
Order. Order. The member will resume his seat. He's alleged. Order. The member is now alleging that the member changed the Hansard. I can assure you that is not the case. I've checked on this. Hansard was a draft prepared by Hansard staff. It turned out to be incorrect, and as soon as that was noted, it was changed.
Speaker, point of order. Point of order.
Point of order,
I'll hear from the Honourable Te Uraraia Flavel first.
Mr Speaker, I take offence to the Honourable Winston Peters suggesting that I changed Hansards. I'd like him to stand and apologise.
Order. No, No, listen, on this occasion, this is a debating matter. I'm trying to assist the Minister by stating the facts clearly in the House today, and certainly I can assure this House there was no attempt by the Minister to alter this Hansard and have that word stuck in. It was order. It was effectively a mistake by Hansard office, and that has been acknowledged. It is a draft Hansard that is done very, very quickly for the benefit of all of us members. It's published in haste and then it's distributed, and that is the opportunity for members collectively to make sure that it's accurate.
Point of order.
I'll hear from the Right Honourable Winston.
Mr. Speaker, if one looks at the television coverage yesterday of this question, it is as clear as daylight. If you follow what was said.
Order.
So, now my question.
Order. The member will immediately sit down. Order. If the member wants to ask a question, get up and do so. I'll accept that. But to go back and re-explain what's in the Hansard when I've covered that off quite adequately is unnecessary. So if the member wants to raise a point of order, I'll hear it.
Mr. Speaker, I want to know how could Hansard possibly change this transcript without the authority of the Minister or someone with his authority from his office? We don't give it to all our staff members.
Member now will resume his seat. I'll explain it once more as clear as I can for the member, and then we will move on. Hansard, prepare Hansard, record very quickly what happens to get it out for members to comment on. A mistake was made. How that made, I don't know. It was made. As soon as it was then distributed, it was picked up by members and corrected. That has been the procedure for as long as the member's been here. To suggest either that it was a deliberate mistake by Hansard or to suggest that it was somehow influenced by the Minister, I assure the member, is absolutely not correct. Does the member have further supplement? No. Order.
No, there will be a point of order.
Order. The member will resume his seat. There may be a point of order. I will invite the member, if he wants to raise a fresh point of order, to certainly do so, but I will not, under any circumstances, entertain from the member a continuation of this point of order. Fresh point of order, Right Honourable.
Seek leave to table a video of the parliamentary coverage
that is
by
completely
television.
Unnecessary, and I'm not prepared to put the leave.
Point of order.
Order. Members have a right to raise points of order. We collectively hope it will be of value. Ron Mark.
I'm trying to be helpful, Mr. Speaker. Could you deliberate then and at a later time give us your view? How are we to reconcile a transcript of ourselves on video with that which is finally produced in Hansard if the two don't match, and how do you as the Speaker intend to ensure that consistency remains?
I have now explained it at least twice as clearly as I can. If I haven't made that clear enough to Ron Mark, then I'm afraid I can't help him. Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Was he so desperate not to debate the Māori Party's whānau ora program with New Zealand First that he broke the law, that he got his CEO mate Power or Maxwell to scrap the debate, which is why he should resign?
The Honourable Te Ura Flavel.
Mr. Speaker, I'm really proud of the efforts that Māori television has done with respect to all sorts of things, in particular around our reo. And I thought I made it really clear to the member yesterday that there was no effort whatsoever to get in the road of the broadcast of the program. In fact, I outlined it really clearly, and I'll do it again for him just for today, that on the 14th of May of this year, we received a request from Māori television to appear. On the same day, the 14th of May, the request was accepted. On the 20th of May, the program was pulled. There was no interference whatsoever, and I gave that assurance to the House. Well, the member seems to think he knows, but he doesn't know nothing. Unfortunately,
Order. Now that answer is quite long enough. Order. Order. Supplementary question, Marama Fox.
Supplementary to the Minister. Did the Minister knowingly mislead the House at any time now, yesterday, in the past weeks, or in the 8 months of his exemplary service as Minister of Māori Development?
The Honourable Te Ura. The Honourable Te Ura level.
Mr Speaker, I'll apologise for getting up fast. I was sort of so anxious to answer that question and to say to my colleague that I take this as an honourable place. I take the position as a Minister as an honourable position, and I don't intend to do anything to jeopardise that.
Question number 6, Alistair Scott.